Have you raised your right hand? Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you shall give this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do, yes.
You can have a seat.
Thank you.
And if you could introduce yourself to the jury and spell your name for the court reporter.
Yes, it's Anique Whitmore, A-N-I-Q-U-E, Whitmore, W-H-I-T-M-O-R-E.
And Ms. Whitmore, how are you currently employed?
I am a psychotherapist in private practice. I have been a psychotherapist since 2001 and licensed in the state of Georgia.
And prior to having a private practice, where were you employed previously?
Prior to private practice, I was the forensic director at Fulton County District Attorney's Office. There, I worked in a specialized unit called Crimes Against Women and Children. And in that unit, we specialized working with vulnerable populations, such as children who have endured some sort of trauma, whether that be child molestation, rape, women who have endured domestic violence, witnessed a traumatic event, stalking cases, child exploitation, human trafficking. And so I would work with the attorneys as well as the victims of cases when trial was coming upon us, as well as helping the attorneys understand the psychodynamic portion of memory recall, child development, how trauma affects the individual.
How long were you employed at the Fulton County District Attorney's Office?
I believe it was about 7 years.
Prior to working at the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, where were you employed?
Prior to the DA's office, I was the clinical and executive director of Harbor House, which is a child advocacy center that covers all of Northwest Georgia. My duties there were very similar to my prior employment to the Harbor House, which is the Georgia Center for Child Advocacy, where I was the program manager. And so there and in both advocacy centers, I supervised the clinical staff. I conducted forensic interviews, conducted forensic evaluations, supervised the clinical staff as well as individuals who were in graduate school and local universities who would come and conduct internships. I would do training, teach the public on child sexual abuse and witness to traumas, how memory affects that. I would educate and work with multidisciplinary team members such as law enforcement, Department of Family and Children Services, the medical profession, attorneys. And so in combination of the two advocacy centers, that was about 8 years of my career, 9 years.
And what is your educational background?
Sure. So my educational background is I have my undergraduate degree from Northwestern University in Illinois, majoring in education and social policy, minoring in counseling psychology, and my graduate studies are also from Northwestern University, getting my master's in counseling psychology.
Now, as part of your education and your training, have you also studied trauma and how trauma affects memory?
Most definitely.
And as part of your education and your training, have you also studied the process of disclosure, how a child discloses abuse?
Yes, I have.
Now, as part of your employment working in the CACs, as well as being the forensic director in Fulton County, have you personally experienced how that process of disclosure works?
I have. So not only have I experienced it as a clinician, but as a forensic specialist, and I also teach in the area. There are several forensic protocols that exist, one being Child First, which used to be called Finding Words. And it is a protocol that was brought to Georgia in the early 2000s when the governor's office reached out to about 7 or 8 of us to educate those who are involved in the investigation process in Georgia, which would include law enforcement, DFACs, forensic specialists, therapists, medical profession. And so we train all of those professionals in the state of Georgia 4 times a year. It's a 40-hour-a-week course. And part of that course is just that, the process of disclosure, how trauma affects an individual and their memory, child development in what we can expect from a child of a certain age, what they can and what we should expect them to say, what we shouldn't expect them to be able to recall and verbalize.
And are you familiar with the literature and research in the area of forensic interviewing as well as the process of disclosure and how trauma affects memory?
I am, yes.
And are you a licensed mental health professional?
I am.
Now, we talked a little bit about the CACs. What is a Child Advocacy Center?
Sure. I could talk for weeks on this. However, a little bit of history. Back in the 70s, when there was abuse of children, and when we say children, we're talking from the ages of about 3 to about 17, or if you're cognitively functioning within those age range. There was investigations conducted that were not the best because there were inappropriate questions asked, leading questions. And so it was in the late 70s, early 80s when there were some major types of cases that went south. They didn't turn out well. And so the powers that be created child advocacy centers so that those individuals were specialized in questioning children of specific ages so that we can gather credible information and then further explore that information. And so employees of an advocacy center most advocacy centers across the country are nonprofit, independent agencies, not hired by law enforcement, but we are a unit that explores allegations or reports of abuse in a non-biased way so that a child can come in and have a fair representation of what they are saying that they've experienced through well-trained individuals. And so it's a center that provides support with those who have reported some sort of trauma. It provides the forensic interview, evaluation, and intervention. It educates the public. And so a main piece of an advocacy center is just that, is the forensic interview. It becomes a piece of the investigation and the file.
Now, you mentioned that you have done some training in Child First, previously Finding Words.
Yes.
How long have you been doing that training?
I believe since 2001 I was contacted. So I guess 18-ish years.
And how many forensic interviews have you conducted?
Myself, I have conducted close to 1,000 taped forensic interviews.
And how many forensic interviews have you reviewed?
Unfortunately, probably quadruple that. I consult on many cases across the country, actually, that involve forensic interviews, and the majority of those clearly are not the ones I've conducted. So to date, my guesstimation would be close to 3,500 to 4,000 forensic interviews.
And have you ever been qualified as an expert witness in court before?
I have.
Have you been qualified in the state of Georgia?
Many times, yes.
Have you been qualified in any other states?
Yes.
And have you been qualified in any other jurisdictions, like federal jurisdictions?
I have. So to date, I've testified in about 32 different jurisdictions, ranging from different states, different types of court, superior, juvenile court, family court, federal court, as well as in the military. I will provide my expertise in cases in which service members have been accused of certain crimes, and they will call me in to become their specialist or consultant in court-martial cases.
Now, in the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, have you reviewed a forensic interview as well as an entire case file and recommended not indicting or not prosecuting a case?
Many times, yes.
And when you did recommend a case for indictment or for prosecution in the Fulton County DA's office, did you also provide your expert testimony in court?
Often, yes.
And have you ever been consulted by a defense attorney but then asked not to testify?
Many. I always say, when I'm asked that question, I always say that my work stands for itself. I will consult and give my expert opinion. However that opinion benefits is not up to me. It's up to those who consult with me. So whether that be for the state or for the respondent or the defense, it's been in my experience when I do consult with the defense, I'm not oftentimes called to testify.
Now, in conducting forensic interviews, approximately what percentage of those interviews were with allegations of physical abuse?
Mm-hmm. I don't break my cases down. I have testified about 390-ish times in the court of law. and I don't break each of those types of cases down, but what I will say is I would guesstimate about 20% of those cases, because when I was involved at the child advocacy centers, of course, we would interview victims of sexual abuse as well as severe physical abuse or witness to physical abuse. And whether or not those cases would go to trial is beyond my control, but I would guesstimate about 20% of those cases.
Your Honor, at this time, I tender Ms. Whitmore as an expert in forensic interviewing and child abuse.
All right, she's asked for forensic interviewing and child abuse. Any objection to treating her as an expert in child abuse?
I haven't heard anything that qualifies her as a child abuse specialist.
No response.
Response?
Your Honor, she just testified about her education and her experience. She talked about that she trains people in the area of child abuse, including the process of disclosure and how trauma affects memory. She studied it. She's also personally had the experience with individuals through her forensic interviews as well as through her therapy. She still trains currently and has been training at Child First since 2001 regarding forensic interviews, and part of that is a process of disclosure and how trauma affects memory.
I'll accept her as an expert in these areas.
Thank you. Ms. Whitmore, prior to your testimony here today, what documents or evidence did you review in connection with this case?
In this case, and as well as many other cases, I will review what's considered discovery, which would entail forensic interviews, medical reports, defects records, mental health records. And so in this particular case, it was those. It was mental health records, defects records, as well as several different forensic interviews.
Now, why is it important to review more than just the forensic interview when evaluating and rendering an opinion on a child abuse case?
Sure. So I see it as a pizza or a puzzle. There are many pieces to it, and the forensic interview is just one piece. It is a mere section of the whole picture. Without it, you're missing a good chunk, because in a forensic interview, most likely it's going to be a child between the ages of 3 and 17. They're being asked questions that are appropriate to their age, and so in that manner, because we're trained in such a way, it elicits that information from that age of child. But there are many other pieces that would corroborate or not corroborate what that child is saying in the forensic. So to enter in and just use a forensic would be, in my opinion, somewhat unethical, and so you need to look at various pieces to see if they fit or see if they don't fit.
Now, a few questions about forensic interviewing. Is it a nationally approved and accredited process?
It is, yes.
And are the techniques used in forensic interviewing evolving?
They are definitely evolving. Forensic interview is much like any other profession. If you are in the world of IT, what you knew in 2000 might be very different than in 2019. Although it might work, whatever you're using, there just may be a better model that exists or a different technique. So it is an evolving practice.
And have there been studies done on how best to conduct a forensic interview?
There have been many.
Have you ever seen a perfect forensic interview?
Never. I have never conducted one, have never consulted on one. I'd like to say I've conducted one myself, but I have not, because that involves personality, it involves the individual in front of you, and because we are human, we are imperfect.
Now, can you have a close to perfect interview and a child who has been abused refuses to disclose abuse?
Oh. Personally, as a forensic specialist, I have had many that have refused to disclose, because there's many facets that come into play when working with a child or a victim of any age. There needs to be comfort. There needs to be an understanding of what's being asked. What are their dynamics? What do they know, and why do they know they're there speaking? Do they know perhaps what the repercussions might be if they were to disclose? Are they embarrassed? Are they afraid? How old are they? Many dynamics take place.
Now, you have reviewed the forensic interview of Millie on November 18, as well as the interview of Millie on December 28.
That's correct.
Okay. And to be fair, would you agree that those 2 recorded interviews did not follow protocol?
I would agree.
Now, however, can you have a less than stellar interview with leading questions and failure to follow protocol, and a child will still truthfully disclose abuse?
Oh, most definitely. That goes into the question that you previously asked and what I testified to, that there is no perfect interview. And even though there may be borderline questions asked or inappropriate questions asked or tactics used, that does not mean that the information shared is inaccurate or not credible.
Now, can anybody bring a child to a child advocacy center and have the child interviewed?
No. So the governor's office has an office that focuses on children and the protocols of how that office or this state wants you to approach children. Whenever there is an act or an allegation, a report of abuse or trauma or witness to, the protocol states that they get a forensic interview. And so that is the child abuse protocol of Georgia, is that there has to be an open investigation for a interview to be requested of a CAC.
And so if a disclosure of abuse occurs prior to the forensic interview, that would mean that the child has already spoken about the abuse.
Most definitely. When a child comes to CAC, 98% of those individuals have already disclosed knowing, witnessing, experiencing something.
So as a forensic specialist, you would expect a child to have discussed the abuse with other individuals prior to seeing them in an interview.
Definitely.
Now I want to turn your attention to the issue of suggestibility.
Okay.
Can you describe what suggestibility is when referring to a forensic interview of a child?
Sure. So suggestibility is just a word that we use that the forensic interviewer in the room is perhaps suggesting something that they perhaps shouldn't to the individual they're asking questions to. However, we are all suggestible as humans. Being suggestible is as simple as saying, "Oh, I think it's cold in here." So I'm looking at you, shivering, suggesting to you that you should be cold because I am, and I'm shaking my head. When working in the forensic aspect, we want to try, our goal is to ask non-suggestive, non-leading questions. However, when working with children and special age children, there are questions that can be considered suggestive but are not horrible. Because if I were to ask, say, a 5 or 6 year old, so tell me about today, or tell me about your day, but I want to know about this day, not about, yesterday. By me saying, tell me about today, since waking up, that is somewhat suggestible versus tell me about what happened on October 23rd. That is suggesting I want you to talk about that day. But that doesn't mean that it is the response you receive back is not credible or inconsistent.
Now, when a child corrects an adult who's asking about the abuse, does that indicate a child is resistant to suggestion?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. When a child during a forensic interview corrects an adult, and does that mean that the child is resistant to suggestion?
Yes. So when a child is able to correct the interviewer, it is a good sign that they are able to fight suggestion, meaning they hear a question that is suggesting something, and that child is able to say, yeah, no, that's not what I said, or that's not what I meant, this is what I meant. That is something that I look for when reviewing a video or a forensic, whether or not they have the ability, the maturity to correct the superior in the room. Not so much the superior, but the adult perhaps in the room.
Now, when a child is able to distinguish between what they personally observed versus what they were told, does that indicate a resistance to suggestion?
Most definitely. So we always encourage a child or an individual to speak about what they've seen, what they can personally tell you versus what they heard on a telephone or through a closed door. So that is another way of displaying a child's ability to fight suggestion.
And are you familiar with the research on suggestibility and what it tells us as it relates to children and repeated questioning of children?
Yes.
And what is that?
Sure. The younger the child, the more suggestible they are. However, research would support, my professional experience would support that even if a child is continuously asked questions and has already showed the ability to fight suggestion, no matter how many questions they are asked, they are still able to provide their experience or their knowledge, their exposure to what they're reporting.
Now I want to ask you about contextual details. In the area of forensic interviewing, what are they? What are we talking about when
Sure.
we mention that word?
Contextual details are the who, what, where, when, what something smelled like, looked like, what happened next, what happened before, what did you do then. It adds context to the disclosure, to the report of what that individual is experienced. If you are talking with an individual and there are gaps, there's no context, it leaves the listener to wonder. So you're looking for that context. Who was there? What did someone say? What were you made to do? What did you see? What did you hear? It provides depth to their report.
Now, what, if anything, is the importance of contextual details as they relate to the issue of suggestibility?
Mm-hmm. The more detail that an individual is able to provide, it provides more reasons to be able to identify that child was not suggested, or was not, her experience or his experience was not suggestible because of that context, because of that depth of information. But you then have to look at the age of the child also. You have to look at their verbal ability. How many words are in the repertoire to be able to describe what they've experienced? If they have been exposed to something that most other 8-year-olds, 3-year-olds have been exposed to, they only have their words to be able to describe what they've witnessed.
Now, I want to turn your attention to Millie's November 18, 2015
Okay.
interview. What, if anything, was significant to you about the fact that Millie, without prompting, describes the cream that the defendant, Joe Rosenbaum, put on her bruises and describes it as smelling like old people and making her skin hot and cold?
For me, as a specialist in the area, that is a genuine, spontaneous, contextualized detail. That is something, a response like that is what she put into her mind as a memory that was important to her because it stood out. It was the smell, what something looked like, where it was applied, where it was, laid to rest, or where it was, sitting on the counter or wherever. That's context. It provides depth.
I want to turn your attention to child abuse and the process of disclosure. What does that term, process of disclosure, mean?
Sure. So just that, it is a process. So it's not a one-time event. It takes time to formulate what you witnessed, what you experienced into words, and who it is that you're going to tell. The analogy that I always typically give, because I'm very visual, so it helps me understand also, is we have all experienced some sort of trauma in life, whether it be a loss in job, a pet, a family member, a relationship. When someone asks you about that traumatic event right away, you may have few words to describe it because you haven't processed it. You may be too emotional. You may be too traumatized. However, a year later, 2 years later, perhaps there's some sort of intervention, time distanced from the traumatic event. You're able to speak about it in more detail. You're able to provide more context because you're not as emotionally attached to it. So if someone called you and told you that your mother was diagnosed with cancer, in that first probably 10, 12 hours would be very difficult. Perhaps after remission or treatment and remission and years of health, you're able to speak about that in more detail. That is a disclosure, the process of disclosure. What questions are being asked in an appropriate way for you to be able to describe your experience?
Now, what, if anything, can family dynamics have on a child's willingness to disclose?
So family dynamics, there's a key relationship, there's a key dynamic. And what I know in this profession is oftentimes we are traumatized not by strangers so much, but those that we love and care for and are cared by. And so that dynamic of being traumatized perhaps by those that you love the most affects your ability to tell detail, the rate at which you tell that detail or report. Because as an individual, you're worried about repercussion. What's going to happen? What's going to happen to them? What's going to happen to me? Will they still love me? Will everyone hate me because of it? Will they get in trouble? So there's a lot of dynamic, especially when you know the offender.
Now, can children have conflicted feelings towards their abusers?
Most definitely. The layperson, and I thought this at one point too, that if you hurt me, I'm going to hate you or, despise you and be done with you. But in my experience and what literature will show is that those who are abused or have been affected by the offender in some sort of way and they're related to them, there's that dynamic of confusion and still love, and you still care for them. You still want to be in their presence. And so someone on the outside may see a relationship that seems tight because the victim perhaps is still loves that individual. I see that all the time, and that's actually one of the in the therapeutic side of what I do when I work with clients. That's one area in which many survivors struggle with is, but I still care for them, but they did this. How can I love someone and they did this? So it occurs all the time.
So would it surprise you if a child appears happy and acts lovingly or loves on their abuser while in a public setting?
No.
Now, if an adult dresses, feeds, clothes, buys the child toys, takes them to community events, takes them to their job and their school, does that mean that the person is not abusing the child?
Absolutely not, no.
What does a child abuser look like?
I wish we had a vision of it, right? I, in my 20-year, 22-year career, have seen a little bit of everything. There is no identified phase. Abusers can range from mothers, fathers, daughters, sisters, pastors, priests, coaches, neighbors. There is not one identifiable phase.
Now, based on your training and experience, is it common or uncommon for a child to provide some details of the abuse to one person and different or additional details to another?
That's what's most common, is that some detail is shared with one and other details are shared with another. It depends on the questions asked. It depends on the child's comfort ability, their ability to give detail based on their age. Unfortunately, in the system, at times, cases can span across years. And so if you're speaking to an individual when they're 10 and are now testifying when they're 18, of course, different information might be spoken about.
Based on your expertise, is it surprising to you that a child will disclose abuse to one person and then later refuse to acknowledge or even talk about the abuse when asked by someone else?
Does not surprise me.
And how come?
Typically, when an individual talks about what they've experienced, their world gets turned upside down. People get mad, people get in trouble, they get looked at like, you must be lying, they lose loved ones in their life, perhaps they're put into defects custody, the ones they love the most are no longer around them. And so what better way than in a child's mind to take all that back and to make the world go back to normal than to say it didn't happen or deny that they know information. So I see it all the time. Literature supports it. Does it make for an investigation to be difficult? Most definitely, but it happens often.
Based on your expertise, can a child's fear of returning to live with the abuser have an effect on their willingness to disclose?
It can, yes.
And based on your expertise, can a child who sees their abuser in court after 4 years, can that affect their willingness to disclose?
Oh, most definitely.
Now, based on your expertise, if a child is in a home where one adult is doing the physical abuse and the other adult stands and watches and is otherwise aware of the abuse, can the child have more positive feelings to the one that's standing by versus the one that is actually committing the physical acts?
They can. Again, every individual is different and may have different response. Children are very concrete, and so they know what they know. And when something is happening concrete to them, such as a physical abuse in this analogy you're giving, and the individual who's watching, that child, depending on their age, may not realize that that individual had the ability to stop it, and they may find them as less abusive or less mean. So yes, the affection towards that other individual may appear as though they is increased or more than the individual physically touching that child.
Have you personally reviewed cases in which adults were in the home at the time the abuse occurred and failed to protect the child?
The majority of the cases I have involve that scenario.
Based on your expertise, is it surprising to you that Millie didn't immediately run and tell either her great-grandmother or biological mother about the abuse at the time it was happening?
It does not surprise me.
And how come?
What we know about abuse cases is that the type of disclosure, the most common type, is delayed, meaning the act occurs and one doesn't find out about it for weeks, months, years later. Again, dynamics of how old is that child? Do they know what to say or to tell? Do they have the support system in which they have the avenue in which to tell? Do they know to report it? What we know in this field is that the younger the child is when they're enduring abuse, that's their normal. It's not for us to judge, but unfortunately that's their world. And so they don't perhaps know that it's okay to report that it's not okay. The analogy that I give, again, analogies, but if you were to tell a young child that that's pink on the wall, they will not know that that's not pink until taught differently, until they learn their colors in school. So if you're being beat in this scenario or abused in some sort of way from a young age, although it's painful and it's an experience, but if it's being conducted by someone that is supposed to love you and you know no different, that's their norm.
Have you personally reviewed cases where other children were in the room at the time the abuse occurred and either didn't witness the abuse or just denied ever witnessing it?
Oh, yes.
I want to turn your attention to the issue of memory.
Okay.
How does one store memory?
Again, could be here for 40 weeks to talk about this, but won't. Memory, our brains are pretty magical. We store what's important to us. We store happy memories in one place. We store traumatic memories in another. The traumatic ones get pushed way back in the back of our head behind a closed, locked door. It takes special questions and specified sequencing of those questions to be able to elicit those memories. Again, like I testified earlier, we've all experienced something in which we don't want to talk about. And we don't want to talk about it with a bunch of strangers for sure. But if that stranger allows us to be comforted, ask us questions that are not too traumatic, we're able to access those memories. So those memories are accessed in questioning of the context. Where were you? How did it make you feel? What did you see? How is it making you feel now when you're talking about it? I see you're uncomfortable. I see you're emotional. How can I help you remember? Or how is there something that you can recall? It's in my experience that oftentimes individuals remember, they just don't want to talk about it. So if someone if I were to ask an interviewee, tell me about A, B, and C, and they say, oh, I don't know, I don't remember. A response of mine is usually or typically is that you don't remember or you don't want to speak about it. Because speaking about it is like ripping off a scab. You have to go to that place. And who wants to go to that place? So depending on what you recall as important. So if you are abused and what was most important to you was what tool that individual used, was it their hands or was it a hammer? Was it a belt? Was it a book? That might not have been important to the victim, but the person who used it was. So that's what the child is going to remember. It's what we find important is what we store.
Now, how are children with remembering specific dates?
Oh, they stink. Some adults are really poor at remembering dates and details. And then you have to look at the age of the child because Have they learned that in school even? Have they mastered that technique? Do they know that when important events happen, that they're to go back into their calendar and write it down? The younger the child, of course not. And especially if multiple acts of abuse occur, what they know is what happened to their body or what has happened to somebody else. Not necessarily it happened on October 5th at 2:02. They just know that they experienced it and they know who did it to them or did it to the other person.
I want to turn your attention to asking you some questions specifically about this case here
Okay.
in court. So in this case, based on your expertise, is it surprising to you that on the day of Laila's death, when Millie was in the hospital, she did not tell anyone that the defendant, Jennifer Rosenbaum, was physically abusive to her or Laila?
It does not surprise me.
And how come?
So trauma works in mysterious ways. Our brains, again, work in magical ways. If we're talking about this case specific, based on the information that I reviewed, this child presents, or excuse me, the older child presents as more parentified, meaning she was in situations in which she was caring for her younger sister. In that manner, was she protecting her by not sharing all that she knew? Did she know what to say? Did she know what was going to happen? Was she afraid? Was she in shock? We don't know those answers. But what I do know, and what literature would support, is that, and it's recent literature that came out in the last 2 or 3 years, in that when you are a trauma victim, witnessing or experiencing it, you need about a 48-hour, you need 2 sleep cycles, so about 48 hours to be able to focus on what it was you experienced, to be able to put words to it, and to be able to describe that to somebody else. Because again, that's how our brains work. We need time to recoup, we need time to process, and especially the younger you are, you need more time to understand.
Now, based on your answer to that question, on the morning of November 18 of 2015, about 15 hours after Laila's death, Millie had her forensic interview. At that time, Millie doesn't disclose abuse, but does acknowledge some of her bruises. Does this mean that Millie's subsequent disclosures are tainted?
Absolutely not.
And is that primarily because of that sleep cycle, 48 hours we discussed?
It's primarily because of a couple things. That sleep cycle, as well as the process of disclosure that I testified earlier about, is that it takes time to formulate what it was you experienced. Again, here's an analogy for you, but it's as if you were in a car accident, and in that moment you're like, oh my gosh, no, and it happens so slow, and you don't want to remember the details of it, but in 2 days, perhaps you're able to speak about it, to give more details. Oh, that's right, I was at the stoplight, and I thought it turned green, and it didn't, and so I turned. More details come. It's that process of disclosure.
Now, after Laila's death, Millie lives with the Lamberts and begins to disclose abuse. The interview that was done is not done in a forensic setting. However, does that mean that Millie's disclosures are tainted?
It does not.
Does it mean that she's inconsistent?
It does not.
Would it mean she's improperly suggestible?
It would not.
During the course of Millie's disclosures, were there certain facts that were consistent throughout the board?
There were consistent facts, correct.
Now, based on your expertise, what, if anything, is significant to you about the fact that Millie consistently said Jennifer told her Laila choked on chicken?
It's significant because of the word told. You have to really break down what children say, individuals, adults. And when Millie was further questioned, it wasn't that she saw it, it was told to her. When a caregiver or someone of authority is in a child's life, tells that child something, such as choked on a piece of chicken, it's something that she heard, she didn't necessarily visualize, and that's what she stuck to. That was her understanding.
And based on your expertise, what, if anything, is significant to you about the fact that Millie consistently says Jennifer told her Laila hurt her leg in gymnastics?
Again, it was the told. It wasn't that Millie was there witnessing it. It was something that she was told.
And based on your experience, what, if anything, is significant to you about the fact that Millie, immediately after Laila's death, told both the ER nurse and the forensic interviewer that Laila died before the ambulance got there?
It was significant, in my opinion, because that to me is something that she saw. That was her understanding because of her physical presence in that home. Because she described what it was that she saw. She spoke about it. She wasn't told. It was what she experienced. Again, you have to look at the vernacular, the what words a child uses to describe what it was that they've experienced. It's that context.
Is it at all surprising to you that Millie was preoccupied by death after Laila died?
Not at all.
Is it at all surprising to you that Millie struggled with issues of trust?
Absolutely not. The individuals that were put into Millie's life were there to protect and care for her as caregivers. It is those people in her life and any other individual's life, that's who you're to trust. And when that trust is broken, that unfortunately, in my experience as a therapist, is a struggle that perhaps Millie may face throughout her life. Trusting those that she technically should be able to.
Those are all the questions I have for you. Thank you, Ms. Whitman.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Andrews-Cross.
Thank you. Good morning, actually.
Good
Ms.
morning.
Whitmore. My name is Corinne Mull, and I've got a number of questions to ask you.
Sure.
What exactly did you review?
If I recall correctly, forensic interviews, several forensic interviews. I reviewed mental health records. I reviewed defects records.
You did not see the interview of Jennifer Rosenbaum, did you?
Your client?
Jennifer Rosenbaum.
Oh, Rosenbaum. No, I did not.
You did not look at that.
No.
There are 50 discs in this case. Which one of those 50s did you look at?
The interviews of Millie.
That's all you looked at.
That's correct.
And you are a child advocate, correct?
No, I'm a psychotherapist working in the area with children.
But you have worked in child advocacy units, haven't you?
No, I was the director of forensic services at the DA's office. I was the director of 2 advocacy centers. Do we advocate for children? We advocate for what they have to say.
And that is absolutely correct. You're here today advocating for what children say, correct? Well, specifically for what Millie said.
No, I disagree. My understanding of being here today is to speak about my experience in the area of child abuse, my expertise, my experience as a therapist, my experience as a director, the 20 years I've taught in the area. Again, I shared with the court that it has been in my career that I have testified for both sides. And so I speak to my expertise, not advocating for one individual over another.
How many times have you testified for the defense?
I don't have a number, but I've testified close to 400 times. I would say a small percentage. Just last week, and in 2 weeks I go to Alaska to testify for the defense. I do not have a specific number.
So you don't know how many?
I don't.
Now, you were talking about Laila knowing that Millie knowing that Laila had died before the ambulance got there.
That was a question asked of me, yes.
Yes. And are you saying here that this 4-year-old or 3-year-old at the time knew the child was dead?
I can't speak to truth. I can speak to what I review because I was not there. What I testified to was based on what was asked of me and what the child said. And it is Millie's understanding that her sister was dead prior to the MEs not MEs, but
Did you review any of the defects records which talked about Peggy Banks coaching Millie?
I did.
Okay. Did you read any of the records of Donna Wazorek,
Refresh me of who that is.
psychologist for Millie?
Yes,
Did you review the records of Ann McCullough?
I did.
Okay. Now, you have said that when she says that Laila died before the ambulance got there, you earlier said she saw Laila die, is what you interpret from that.
I interpreted the verbiage that she used in comparison to choking on chicken. She was told she was choked versus she died.
But as you sit here today, you don't know if that child died before in front of Millie, do you?
Me personally, I
Yes.
do not know.
You don't know if that child died in the ambulance or on the way, do you?
I don't personally, but looking at records that I've read, I know what has been concluded.
But you don't know whether the child died in the ambulance, on the spot, or in the hospital.
Me
do you?
personally, I do not. I did not declare her death.
And you were not there present.
That's correct.
And you do not know that Millie saw her die. You do not know that.
I do not.
Is there anything, Ms. Whitmore, anything a child would say in the context of a forensic interview that would surprise you?
Oh, I have been surprised many times.
Thank you, that's all I have.
You said that you've been surprised many times. Tell me about those surprises.
How much time do you have? I have been surprised at the language used. I have been surprised by the details provided. I have been surprised at what children have had to endure in witnessing and physically feeling. I have been surprised at the emotion or lack of emotion of a child and what they've endured and what they've reported. I have been surprised in human nature and what individuals have done. I have been surprised in, oh my gosh, I could just speak a ton. I have been surprised many times.
And when you are reviewing forensic interviews, as you did in this case, are you also looking for signs of coaching?
Oh, all the time.
And in these two interviews that you reviewed, did you see any signs of coaching?
I did not.
And during your review of forensic interviews, you also look for issues of suggestibility.
I do.
And do you also look for any red flags or any issues that would suggest a child is suggestible?
I always do, yes.
And specifically with Millie, was there any indication that she was suggestible?
I will say there were questions that were asked that were suggestible. For me as a specialist in the area, that does not mean it's a negative. Again, there's no perfect interview, and you have to look at the answer given to that suggestive question. If there's context provided in that answer, the who, the what, how something felt, what did you see, what did you hear, what happened next, it solidifies that child's experience. In addition to that, I will look what else is supporting what that child is saying. Are there corroborating pieces of the puzzle that will support what this child says? So just because a leading question is asked or a suggestive question does not negate what that child does have to say.
Now, in terms of the language Millie used, was there anything surprising about her language?
There was not.
And in terms of the details Millie used, was there anything concerning about those details?
There was not.
And in terms of what Millie endured, was there concern about what she endured?
Yes.
Thank you. No further questions.
You're welcome.
Any problems? Nothing else? Thank you, ma'am. You can step down.
Thank you.
Any objections to this being excused? And you're free to go.
Thank you.